This chapter covers the spinal cord and the spinal nerves. The spinal cord is a vital link between the brain and the rest of the body. Remember, it's part of the central nervous system, just like the brain is. And the spinal nerves themselves serve two important functions. They take information towards the brain and also take information away from the brain. So the nerves that take information towards the brain is called afferent information, and the nerves that take information away from the brain is called efferent information. They are also responsible for reflexes, which are our quickest reactions to stimuli. The gross anatomy of the spinal cord begins with the spinal cord, the beginning of it, just inferior to the medulla oblongata, the most inferior portion of the brainstem. And it then extends from that point in an inferior direction and has five specific parts, beginning with the cervical part, then the thoracic part, the lumbar part, the sacral part, and then finally the coccygeal part. The spinal cord itself is going to extend from the foramen magnum, which is a large foramen in the occipital bone that the spinal cord passes through, and it goes all the way down to the L1 vertebrae. Notice there are specific enlargements of the spinal cord called the cervical enlargement. There's also another enlargement in the lumbar region, the lumbosacral enlargement, and there are some plexuses. There's a cervical plexus, a brachial plexus, where important spinal nerves enter and exit the spinal cord. There is also a lumbar plexus and a sacral plexus. The conus medullaris is the point at which the spinal cord actually ends at L1. The spinal cord itself is actually shorter than the vertebral column, and the coccygeal part of the spinal cord is in the L1 vertebrae. So in this image to your right here, what you're seeing is an image of the spinal cord, and the area that is beneath the spinal cord is called the cauda equina, and it's called this because it's at the caudal end, and it also resembles a horsetail. It's axons that extend inferiorly from the spinal cord's conus medullaris. So the conus medullaris itself is going to resemble a cone-like structure, and it's the tapering at the inferior end of the spinal cord. There's also a structure called the filum terminale, which is a thin strand of the pia mater within the cauda equina that attaches the conus medullaris to the coccyx. So the spinal cord is going to have 31 total pairs, all of which are mixed nerves, which, remember, mixed means that it has both motor and sensory axons. The groups of spinal nerves are 8 in the cervical region. So I want you to notice that this is different than the amount of vertebrae. Recall that there are actually 7 cervical vertebrae. The rest of the spinal nerves are actually going to match the number of vertebrae. So there are 12 thoracic nerves. Remember, there's 12 thoracic vertebrae. There's 5 lumbar nerves. There's also 5 lumbar vertebrae. There's 5 sacral nerves, and there are also 5 fused sacral vertebrae, which forms one sacrum bone. And then there is one coccygeal nerve. So you had to learn the names for the 12 cranial nerves, but there are not specific names for the 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Now, when we look at the anatomy of a vertebrae, you can see some of the similar structures you've seen earlier, like the spinous process of the vertebrae, the body of the vertebrae, the epidural space, dura mater, pia mater, and subarachnoid space and arachnoid mater. Notice that the spinal nerve, again, which is a mixed nerve, is going to enter and exit various levels of the spinal cord between the different vertebrae. So the spinal cord meninges are continuous with the cranial meninges. The epidural space sits between the dura and the periosteum of the vertebra. Remember that the prefix epi means on top of, just like the epigastric region that you learned about early on in the semester sits on top of the stomach. So epidural anesthesia are given into the epidural space. And the dura mater is going to surround the spinal cord. It consists of a single meningeal layer, which is different than in the brain. Remember, in the brain, it was a double layer membrane. The spinal cord meninges include a narrow subdural space, which is separating the dura mater from deeper arachnoid mater. The subarachnoid space is a real space filled with cerebrospinal fluid. And the pia mater, just like in the brain, is an innermost meninx. Meninx would be singular for meninges. Looking at a transverse section of the spinal cord, we see white matter as well as gray matter. You don't have to know the individual names of the white matter, but just know that the white matter is going to be groups of axons. The gray matter, in contrast, is going to be dendrites and unmyelinated neurons as well as cell bodies. The cell body is kind of partitioned into this inner gray matter region and an outer white matter region. So the gray matter is dendrites, cell bodies, unmyelinated axons, as well as glial cells, whereas the white matter is myelinated axons, specifically tracts. And these are projection tracts that are either going to go from the spinal cord to the brain or go from the brain to the spinal cord. Spinal nerves, there's 31 pairs, as you already know, that extend from the spinal cord. They make up motor and sensory axons. So just a reminder, that means that they are mixed. And they have those connective tissue wrappings, which you've already learned about. The endoneurium, perineurium, which surrounds a fascicle, and the epineurium, which surrounds an entire nerve. The endoneurium would be surrounding an axon. The spinal nerves are going to be numbered according to the locations of the intervertebral foramina that they use to exit. So the first 7 spinal nerves are going to exit the intervertebral foramen above the vertebrae of the same number, but the 8th cervical nerve is going to exit above the first thoracic vertebra. So again, that's the one exception. The remaining spinal nerves are going to exit below the vertebra of that same number. So because the spinal cord is shorter than the vertebral canal, the roots of the lumbar and sacral spinal nerves travel inferiorly to reach their respective intervertebral foramen.